Here to introduce our speaker, Dr. Ken Sawyer from McCormick Theological Seminary. He's doing the second of the three series on Presbyterianism in America. Last week we covered the early church fathers like John Calvin and Ehrlich Zwingli, and the following two episodes will be what it means to be a Presbyterian today, how we got here, what differentiates us from other Presbyterian groups and other Protestant denominations. So I'm looking forward to the lecture. I'll start us off with prayer and we can begin. Dear God, thank you for bringing us together once again to learn about the history of your church. As we learn, give us insight into how the teachings of the early church fathers can help us become closer to you and better to our fellow man. Keep our ears open so that we may hear what will help us become better Christians. Amen. So we will start with the lecture. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, Sam.
You're welcome.
Good morning. Good morning.
Sorry.
I was reminded just yesterday of an event that happened to me a few years ago. I was teaching in my congregation, Progressive Community Church. Greetings from the pastor and everyone there. We started up a Bible Institute in the church. So I was teaching a class, and someone showed up late. He came in late. And he said, sorry I'm late. I had to stop at the hospital to drop my wife off. She broke her leg. Wow. So we all agreed that the one place he shouldn't be was in class. And he needed to go back to the hospital. Yesterday morning, my wife was over at Progressive. She's a member of the Altar Guild, was cleaning the sanctuary and took a tumble down 20 steps down a flight of stairs. And so she's fine. She's under the care of one, two, or all three of our daughters. So she sends her greetings, but she won't be joining us today. Fractured her right wrist on the way down. And we just are great. Yeah, I'm away, right. So, the blessing of my three daughters, and so keep my wife Patricia Cloud, my wife, close in thought and prayer. She's healing well, and slept wonderfully through the night. So grateful for all the docs and nurses and pharmacists, perhaps especially the pharmacists, at the University of Chicago Hospital. We live 5 minutes from the main university library, and so therefore 5 minutes also from the emergency room. So I bring you greetings from everyone there. Chaplains, doctors, just get to meet people who are doing good things and seeking to repair this broken world. One person, one bed, one crisis, one promise at a time. So I'm very glad to be here, grateful to be here. Last Sunday after class, I was confused when Amy said, you can be here till noon. Thank you, Amy. You said 12, be here till 12. And I thought, oh yeah, we'll be here till midnight. That's great. Because let's face it, we've got a lot of ground to cover. Or to uncover, I don't know. I left class last week and leapt into the car, picked up one of my daughters, and we drove out to the Quad Cities for the ordination and installation of two of my former students who are co-pastoring in a little town named Aledo and a little hamlet called Hamlet. And so it's a great gift to see people discover their call, to discover their voice, to find a way by which they can add their voice and their gifts to the ongoing conversation that is the church. So It's good to see them, good to see the work of the church. And in these profoundly anti-institutional times, Justin, it's good to hear about those who plant, those who water, those who cultivate and build and build. So in these days, you oftentimes hear people say, burn it down. But it's important to remember as well that somebody needs to be planting. Somebody needs to be nourishing and nurturing and cultivating and curating so that when those hungry times come, there's seed to distribute and food to share. And that's one of the reasons why I'm so glad to be here. The teaching office of the church is alive and well in this congregation, in this gifted congregation. Thank you for being here today. Last week, this is a 3-week series, right? 3 weeks? Ooh. When did we start? 3-week series about American religion with a special focus on the Reformed tradition, which has been disproportionately present and influential within the American story, within the story of the Americas. And last week we were talking about Reformation roots, and this week we're going to talk about New World routes. So let's get started. Here's John Calvin and Martin Luther asking for something that neither of them ever did, asking for directions. Right? And I think it's odd that that Calvin has allowed himself to be the passenger rather than the driver. But I don't know. Anyway, old world Christianity in a new world. And as we'll see, the different Reformation traditions are all found here in the New World, and some of them founder here, and some of them flourish here. The group that we identified last week with this chorus of reformers, John Knox, Catherine Zell, a woman's name, that's right, Catherine Zell, reformer, one of the reformers of the city of Strasbourg, a person worth knowing and worth her own adult education series. Just a note for next time. So Catherine Zell, John Knox, Ulrich Zwingli, this whole group of folk, including John Calvin as well in the second generation, that this Reformed tradition distinguishes that particular strand from other Reformation traditions, like the Lutherans, like the Anabaptists, the Mennonites, the Hutterites, the Amish, and those folk, or the English Reformation, the Anglicans, or the continuing Roman Catholic ferment and reform. It is the Reformed folk, the Reformed and Presbyterian folk, who helped constitute the dissenting groups in England and in the Low Countries. Any Puritans or Pilgrims in the room? Mostly Reformed in their orientation. Focus on the danger of idolatry, focus on the teaching office of the church and the reformation of self, community, and world. Focus on the positive place of law, such that while Lutherans will say law and gospel are always eternally at odds with one another, law versus gospel, the Reformed folk would say, well, God's grace is also present, powerful, and provided in the midst of the law as well. The Reformed tradition understands what the psalmist says when the psalmist confesses, Lord, I love thy law. So that whenever Luther would hear that, the hair on the back of his neck would stand up, because for him, law and gospel were always, always, always in tension with one another. The Reformed tradition, which predominates and populates the colonies of New England and the even in a place like Pennsylvania and a few in the South as well, has a predominant perspective, a predominant power, and a predominant ability to write histories. So the narratives of colonial history are mostly composed by Reformed folk. The histories are written by Reformed historians. The sermons are preached by Reformed pastors. The devotions are written by women and men within households where the Reformed themes are the categories and lens and the structures which help make sense of the tumult of the world. Reformed Christianity then becomes the foundational perspective for much of colonial American religion. Sure, there were Lutherans. Sure, there were the occasional Mennonite. And I think that would be a good name for a memoir, The Occasional Mennonite. Right? Lutherans, Mennonites, Catholics, bunch of folk. But the predominant voice, and those who were running the city governments, the village governments, and those who were founding the colleges, and those who were teaching the children, tended to be Reformed in their sensibilities, whether they were Congregationalists, Presbyterians, or Anglicans. The Reformed theology informed their worldview regardless of their polity. Remember last week we concluded with 3 ways of organizing the church. The Episcopal ways, where the power to ordain is in the hands of the bishop, and you've got to wait for the bishop in order to get ordained or get confirmed or get disciplined or get tossed, right? Or the power of the Congregationalist mode, in which if we were to shut this door, we could form a church right by ourselves. We had all that we need here. And then there was that unfortunate dust-up of the election of Leroy, and then tossing you from office as well, right? You look like you've recovered and from those wounds. And in between the Episcopal and the Congregational forms of governance are the Presbyterian forms of governance, presbyterial. And what does that word mean? Anyone suffer from presbyosis? Anyone? You do.
Well, just ability to define it's a combination. It's presbyopia would be why I'm changing glasses all the time.
Exactly right. Your optometrist or ophthalmologist would point out that presbyopia means that your eyes are getting older. It means older. It means elders. Y'all have elders here, right? And depending on the oh, there it is.
Glasses and the whole thing.
Excellent. Polity by elders, right? And so the question becomes, what are these elders doing? Are they cooperating with each other? Are they forming associations? Are they together just for ad hoc reasons, or is there a continuing association between them? So, in New England, founded primarily by Congregationalists, but many of these congregations of Congregationalists also include some Presbyterians too. And so, beginning in this as early as 1628 in what was New Amsterdam, there is a Dutch Reformed church which is organized, congregation that is organized as basically a Presbyterian church, Presbyterian in its polity. And in the 1640s and 1650s, Presbyterians begin to gather and organize themselves in congregations, whether in Maryland or on Long Island. And so what does it mean to be Presbyterian? It means the elders cooperate with one another. The elders connect with one another across congregations, that the pastors, or the pastor and the teacher, 2 different offices, so that in New England, for example, they had their pastor, but they also had a teacher. Interesting. Straight out of Bucer's reform in the city of Strasbourg, right? So the elders, whether they're teaching elders or ruling elders, then depends on the context and the denominational particulars there. But this tends to excite certain congregationalists who are threatened by all this cooperation going on among these Presbyterians or among these elders who are spending too much time together. The Congregationists would say, we have what we need here. There's no need for some overarching association or some group of continuing elders or some pastors group. So, I mean, some of these early American congregations are a kind of mixture, as I mentioned in one of these articles. They are Presbygational Congregarians or Congregarian I don't know. But eventually the Presbyterians get organized. They send missions. They send different missions folk. And the most famous, of course, is Francis McKemey, who comes as a missioner from Ulster. He works in the Caribbean for a while. He gathers several congregations in Delaware and in Maryland. And in Philadelphia, he gathers a group of teaching elders into the first presbytery in 1706. So there's a, let's see. Oh, here's what we're doing today. Reformation roots, New World realities. Yes, yes, check, check. Formation, revival, slavery, past and present. Right, okay. I wanted to present this because it's kind of demoralizing. And the ways in which, we see Reformation roots, and then we see the ways in which Reformation roots can get confused. And this is part of what I think happens to some parts of Calvinism as well. This is from a nice Puritan work by the name of The Golden Chain by a wonderful writer, one of my favorites, William Perkins. In it, he says, the story of salvation is so clear that I can draw it in the form of a road map. And he might as well have had a sign here that says, you are here, right? You're either blessed or you are damned. And that there is a conversation that took place long before the foundation of the world between God the Father, God the Son, and God the Spirit, God, Trinitarian. And they decreed, because of God's foreknowledge, they decreed, and we can deduce from their decrees where we are in our experience. Wow. Some literary analysts speak of concretizing a metaphor. Well, that's what happened. If you have reduced the mystery of salvation to a roadmap, something has gone wrong. Because the Spirit of God that we know about tends to find a way, whether on the map or off the map. And this can be mapped also to the dramas then of religion in the Americas, and especially within North America, and especially in the arguments, the conversations, the yearnings, the dreams, the hymns. Oh, incidentally, I was so pleased to hear just the hint of a drum in worship this morning. I thought, hey, y'all can move too. Okay, so it was nice. So the drama of worship, the drama of song, the drama of preaching, the drama of architecture, even the drama of committees, all then call a lie to this kind of schematic presentation, that life is too interesting to be reduced to this kind of a concretized metaphor. This is just as frightening, I think, but more productive. It's a good, accurate schematic of the historical development of these different denominational strands of American Presbyterianism. And you can also find where you are on this map, but this is a little more generous than the one that we were just looking at. My conviction, and is that the issues that that false roadmap offers is neatly illustrated in the life and lives of American Presbyterianism and American denominations. Let's talk about denominations. What is a denomination? Well, it's an American invention. What is it? It's a voluntary organization that has particular, specific, pointed purposes, right? Evangelization, education, publication, congregational formation and funding, support, extension. Right? So it's a good organizational modality, especially if you are a moving transitory population, right? Westward expansion, right? Well suited. This American invention, the denomination, is not the only way of organizing church. Church happens in lots of ways. We're seeing that now. Emerging church, house church, small groups, supper church, veterinarian church. No, I don't know about, cowboy church. I don't know. There's lots of ways of being church, lots of ways of being faithful. Denominationalism served a profoundly important, central, and productive generative reality, especially in the colonial period. That Episcopalians, Presbyterians, Congregationalists, and then also those upstart Methodists and those hidebound Lutherans and those traditionalist Catholics all continued on building, and competing, right? So the American story is one of competition as well. McCamey comes at a very profoundly important time. 1706 gathers the first presbytery. 1716 gathers the first synod, right, and organizes these Presbyterians starting in Philadelphia. First they're pastors, but then at least as early as the second, no later than the second meeting, the elders join them, right? So that there was a parity of presbyters, a basic equality of the presbyters, the elders, those who were pastors and those who were teaching elders as well, right? So this denominational plant that begins in 1706, grows in 1716, continues to grow through the 18th century. There are some key events, though, that we need to know about because they are both threats to the baby in the cradle of American Presbyterianism in the colonial period and also charters of liberty. Now, I've handed out to you something called the Adopting Act. The Adopting Act. Thank you. The Adopting Act. Now, Presbyterians divided themselves on, depending on their own makeup, their own perspective, their own preferences, their own prejudices as well. American Presbyterianism is a composite reality. There's some English Puritans, there are some Scots-Irish folk, there are some Old Line Scots folk, and there are some French Huguenots, Huguenot folk. There are some Dutch Reformed folk as well. It's a mixture, an amalgam. And how the church is organized and disciplined is itself something worth considering, worth arguing over, and eventually we'll see that Presbyterians are quite willing to split the church on some of these points too. We come from a somewhat contentious people, and occasionally eye-gouging people, right? This is one of the fights. It is at once a charter of liberty and something which is so precious and binds us together, and has also, since 1729, when it was voted on and accepted by this little band of Presbyterians, it has also been a point of contention. It's not like a little bit of sand that, forms a pearl, No, it's like a raspberry seed or something instead. Right. So, the Adopting Act of 1729. How tightly will Presbyterians be bound to the words and the intent of the Westminster Assembly of Faith? You've read it, right? It's basically this schematic that we were looking at earlier, this deductive schematic. And there are some who say it's impossible to believe a church in which there is no doctrinal standard. We need to sign on the bottom line, on the dotted line, and accept the binding of the Westminster Confession. And then others, mostly Puritans, New England Puritans, said, we can't imagine our conscience bound by this deductive roadmap, this concretized metaphorical presentation of God's grace. God's grace is bigger than any formula. Well, so what did they do? They formed a committee. And the committee said, yes, 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 now let's vote. They adopted the Westminster Assembly, but they adopted the Westminster Assembly as a guide, as a goad to press them to think about things they didn't want to think about, and as a point at which our own individual formation comes into conversation, collective conversation, communal conversation, governance conversation, particularly on the level of the presbytery. So let's look at this curious document from 1729. Oh, okay. The committee brought in an overture upon the affair of the confession, after long debating upon it, was agreed upon in these words. Right. Although the synod does not claim or pretend to any authority of imposing our faith on other people's consciences, but we do profess our just dissatisfaction with and abhorrence of such impositions. God alone is the Lord of the conscience, right? That's what the confessions say. But how do we live with people we disagree with? They're going to suggest some ways here. Somewhat timely, wouldn't you say? When's the election? Right. We profess our just, pardon me? Yes, thank you. Thank you. That explains that rash I've got. That's right. And we do utterly disclaim all legislative power and authority of such impositions. Separation of church and state does not mean the non-interaction of church and state. Being willing to receive one another as Christ has received us to the glory of God, and admit to fellowship and sacred ordinances all such as we have grounds to believe Christ will at last admit to the kingdom of heaven. Yet, does this make my yet look big? Yes, yet we are undoubtedly obliged to take care that the faith once delivered to the saints be kept pure and uncorrupt among us, and so hand down to our posterity. So the presbytery is having a conversation, and the presbytery becomes the centering part of American Presbyterianism. Not the General Assembly, there isn't one yet. Not the congregation or the session, but rather the presbytery. It is the presbytery where these arguments take place. It is the presbytery where candidates present themselves, where your pastors in training show themselves and present themselves and risk being in conversation with the people with whom they will be ministering, right? So the very heart of negotiation, compromise, argument, or peaceful separation is rooted right here in the presbytery. It's incredible, right? And so, key word here, scruple. If you, well, and another key word, essential, says that for you to join us in this presbytery, we need to be in agreement about all essentials of the faith. But in this document, the essentials are not defined. But the process is defined. The process is mandated. The process is specified so that women and men, well, then men, and then later women as well, enter into a covenantal conversational relationship within the presbytery, within the committees for the preparation of ministry of their counterparts, so that the essentials of a candidate's faith are shared, that the scruples concerning individual reservations about doctrinal points are shared, and that the vote of the presbytery to accept or to reject becomes a binding covenantal expression of conversational fidelity and doctrinal fidelity as well. So what happens here? We have here a process whereby those who join the Presbyterian Church and become ministers within the Presbyterian Church are understood to be required to discuss the essentials of the faith, but it is not defined what those essentials are. And the process by which those conversations take place then is mandated, endorsed, and defined in some ways, so that if you can't find ways of agreeing, you can find ways of being charitable even in separation. So that the scorched earth policy that we see so often is a deviation from the wise counsel of the Adopting Act of 1729. Please. The Synod is adopting this and as rules for each of the presbyteries. Right, but the Synod is composed of 4 presbyteries at this time. So this is the way by which to incorporate and to assess new ministers and to confront scandal and to excise mean-spirited dissent and to find some middle way between, you can believe anything, or you have to believe this specific thing. That the Presbyterial way shows itself here as capable of seeking a middle way, seeking a generative way that includes some difference and includes the central unifying realities that bind us all.
So, my experience of what you're saying is it's an opportunity for healing and growth and upliftment. Because as people learn together, yes, there may be some disagreements, but it sounds like a wonderful, uplifting, if people are caring and loving.
If people are caring and loving, I love that phrase, because it is their caring and their loving that is put to the test very early on. He said, oh yes, after they took this vote, then Presbyterians in Philadelphia and in New York began to argue over the breadth or the specifics of the Adopting Act. So what was formulated as a way of expressing loving regard can also be a point of difference and division and dissent as well. So wonderful point here. And that's exactly what happens between 1741 and 1758. If you look at the map of the denomination, the first of many splits takes place. And the split is over issues of revival. So this church that is dedicated to unity is split between the new side, pro-revival, and the old side, resistant to revival. That's interesting. Let's look at a couple of the leaders of the revival. I've given you a section of one of the sermons by this man, Gilbert Tennant. The dangers of an unconverted ministry. Ouch. Or Jonathan Edwards, of course, America's great theologian, 1703 to 1758. It was his wife who said, Jonathan, come out of your study long enough to see what God is doing in the congregation, in the neighborhood, in this culture. It was Sarah Edwards who brought the fertile and fecund intellect of Jonathan Edwards into an engagement with the Great Awakening, the first Great Awakening, this great renewal, revival, reformation that helped generate and help intensify so much of American culture, and generated as well its first non-political celebrity, George Whitefield. George Whitefield, here marvelously portrayed with a mild case of strabismus, cross-eyed. Great preacher, national celebrity. He was on several national tours of preaching. He would go to the churches, they would turn him out. So he brought his own pulpit, portable, foldable pulpit. He was a great preacher, a great preacher. It was said that he could bring people to tears merely by the way he pronounced the word Mesopotamia. I'm going to try it one more time. Mesopotamia. No one's crying. Oh, all right, so Mesopotamia. He was a great preacher. Benjamin Franklin, that meddler extraordinaire, Benjamin Franklin, who had the temerity of donating to every group in Philadelphia in hopes that they would argue with themselves, with each other. He once went to hear Whitefield preach, and he started where Whitefield was preaching, and then he just kept walking until he could no longer hear him. And some say that he was testing Whitefield's skills as a speaker, but I think that he was in fact indulging his own preferences to no longer hear him, right? Anyway, Whitefield, Edwards, Tennant, three great preachers of the first Great Awakening. The first Great Awakening helps enliven and in some areas divides churches too. Jonathan Edwards complained that one of his tutors at Yale had as much grace in him as the leg of a chair. That's kind of an uncharitable observation because, I mean, I've seen supportive, right? Decorative, right? Right, okay. So the church is split. There were pro-revival congregations and anti-revival congregations. The Presbyterians split as well between 1741 and then in 1758 they came back together again just at the very date of the death of Jonathan Edwards, 1758. They agreed to no longer quarrel over revivals, but rather to wait and see what God was doing through the revivals, to see what was of God and what was just something to be put to the side, something excessive. I mean, Gilbert Tennant repented of his excessive, invidious, finger-pointing sermonizing. And in some ways, he kind of cooled down from the firebrand pro-revivalist that he had been. He grew up a bit, and he grew into a powerful and productive Presbyterian pastor. He learned to build more bridges than he was burning, and to build up through catechesis, encouragement, admonition, and preparation, pastoral work, than through the provocation of a fiery sermon. That's interesting. The nature of revivalist preaching tends to be abstracted from the rest of congregational life, right? So you can go to a revival and not have the sacraments. You can go to the revival and convince yourself that what matters is right then, right there, right now, and fail to realize the ways in which God has prepared you for that moment, that your community educated you and loved you before you came to the revival meeting and will love you afterwards as well, the ways in which the sacraments nurture us, teach us, instruct us, and correct us, even when we're too certain that we know better than the wisdom of the church, and that what's happening in this overheated auditorium of the revival meeting is more important than the quieter work of God among God's people. Right? So the struggle of revivalism continues, doesn't it? It's a theme that runs through American Presbyterian history as well. Try it one more time. Mesopotamia. The drama of the new nation after the cooling of the First Great Awakening. Whitefield dies in 1770. Edwards had died in 58. And the drama of living within the imperial realities of England and the dramas about accountability, the themes of freedom, the expanding realities of indentured servitude and varieties of slavery, the preponderance of slavery, even in New England, so that Jonathan Edwards had slaves. I mean, it's a shocking thing, right? So when the pastors speak of freedom, it's not just Abigail Adams and others, but it's also a variety of Presbyterian pastors who say, freedom? Whose freedom are you talking about? If we deserve these freedoms, then why is it that the servant who lives in your house is not entitled to that freedom as well? And here it is. I mean, the founding of the American nation includes a variety of compromises. And Episcopalians, Congregationalists, and Presbyterians are right there in the center, not only of those magnificent acts of freedom, but also in those ethical compromises that blunted the liberative word and message of the gospel. So that we see here the main line of American Presbyterian history through the Presbyterian Church USA is joined with other Presbyterian groups, like the Scots, who are not going to be compromising on issues of slavery. They're going to found denominations like the Free Presbyterians, or they're going to demand that if you're a member of this Presbyterian denomination, that you can neither own slaves nor endorse the owning of slaves. And so the conversation about, controversy over, and disputes regarding the issues of freedom and slavery run right through American Presbyterianism, especially in the General Assembly's minutes. Here, I've taken the time of printing this so that you don't have to. But the last time that the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church USA spoke publicly, published publicly about the issue of slavery was so early in the conflict and so late in the day that we displayed our ethical compromises by the language of this General Assembly statement in 1818. It says we're doing a lot to make known the obligations and sentiments of the churches, and the voluntary enslaving of people. We're against it, but we're not going to talk about it. We're against it, but we're not going to discipline slave owners. We're against it, and we're hoping that it will fade away in time. Wow, so we're not going to talk about it, and which meant that the slave powers within the Presbyterian Church USA had muzzled or silenced even the denomination dedicated to the liberative message of the gospel. Wow. So throughout the first half of the 19th century, this issue of slavery is continuously agitating and dividing congregations, households, families, siblings, and the enticements of the proliferation of the enslaved population and the numbers and the enticements of the financial rewards available for those who would invest in and benefit from the slave power continue to grow. so that those who agitated against slavery, those who argued for equality, those who organized boycotts, divestment, and other means, today have their counterparts in the first half of the 19th century. What became McCormick Seminary, named for Cyrus McCormick, who wasn't pro-slavery, but he was anti-slavery. Right? I mean, the varieties of sentiments here in the early 19th century are really damnably complicated, right? Or Lane Theological Seminary in Cincinnati. The first president of Lane Seminary was Lyman Beecher. His daughter, Harriet Beecher, came with him to Cincinnati, and Lane Seminary was an anti-slavery seminary. Right. So in 1837, when the Presbyterian Church splits again between the New School Presbyterians, anti-slavery, pro-cooperation, pro-evangelism, pro-missions, pro-engagement, that New School Presbyterian strand is thrown out of the church by the old Presbyterians, the old school Presbyterians, who like to do things in the traditional way, like to focus on denominational identity for publication, evangelism, and institutional support as well. So this is a split that took place in the Northern Presbyterian Church from 1837 to 1868. Interesting. There are other things that are going on in the country's history, but they are reflected, they are engaged, they are divisive, they are fruitful, they are clarifying within the church in its divided forms between 1837 and 1868. Oh, of course, when Abraham Lincoln met Harriet Beecher Stowe, what did he say? Oh, you're the little lady who started this war, right? There are others, like at Lane Seminary, this man, Theodore Dwight Weld. Here he is pictured with his wonderful wife, one of the Grimke sisters, right? I think they've had a long day. a very long day with their 3 kids, right? Radical abolitionist, right? And so we have these twin truths, order and ardor, or freedom and compromise. These are routed right through all of American religious history, but especially within this mainline tradition, the Presbyterian Church USA. Interesting. Please.
Was there a northern and southern divide in the church at this point?
Yes, at the time of the war, 1861, a group of folk immediately at the outbreak of the war organized the Presbyterian Church in the Confederacy. And it endures from the war until 1983. Right, when the northern and southern churches reunited to form the current form of this denomination. Interesting, right? There are other groups too, like the United Presbyterian Church of North America, a group of mostly Scots seceders. They organized in 1858, and they endured for a century until 1958, and they joined then with the Presbyterian Church USA. You can see it on the map. In order to form the United Presbyterian Church USA. This congregation was part of that denomination. And then in 1983, this congregation joins in that new denominational formation of the Presbyterian Church USA, 1983. And then other groups break away, don't they? Like the Presbyterian Church in America, or the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. We'll be talking about them next week, or other groups too. Do you have a question or observation? Please.
Yes. I have several to straighten out my thinking. The first one is the synod. Do we still have the synod today?
Yeah, fine question, because in so many ways, the organizational gift of Presbytery, Synod, and General Assembly, the first General Assembly in 1788, 1789, that the middle judicatories, the synods, are in trouble now. And so this gift of mediation, this gift of representational mediation, is in shadow right now. And the dynamism tends to be more local, and the fireworks tend to be more national. And the way through of these mediating intermediate governance courts is in shadow and shade just now. So you raise a good question.
So another that would be like people had really strong feelings, even though the North and the South came together, say, on slavery. People had really strong feelings about gays and lesbians, and that committee was like 16 years. So was the Synod involved in their mediation?
In some places successfully, in other places unsuccessfully. And that the longer term challenges and changes of amalgamating different denominational traditions in these unions or reunions, and the ongoing the blossoming of what can only be described as the gift of localism, so that most Americans would say right now, the vitality of the church is local, in the congregation. And then we tend to fall off when we talk about the importance of the presbytery, the importance of the synod, the importance of the General Assembly. We have set aside the gifts of this particular way of organizing the whole people of God in order to pay attention to the gifts of the vitality and dynamism of interaction, interpersonal bonds, and localism. But history has a way of reminding us of some of our blind spots while we are insisting on our insights, right? And so the gift of this way of being the church may experience a resurgence in time. I hope so. I think we're all praying for renewal and revival and reformation. We should. And decency and civility and fidelity. That these be the gifts of the church as we go forward. That's what some of these folks were striving for as well. But before we need to turn to the period after the Civil War. And these three folk, the one in the center is our old favorite, Cyrus McCormick. In 1858, he said, "Oh, there's a little seminary in New Albany, Indiana. Let's bring it to Chicago. I'll pay for the first 4 professors. I'll pay for the operating budget. But I won't pay for the caterer." No, he also paid for the caterer too. What was a little seminary in Indiana comes to Chicago. But what is Chicago? Chicago's on the frontier at that time, right? Chicago is part of the old Northwest Territories. It is a predominantly New School city. It's a predominantly New School presbytery. Most of its pastors are New School Presbyterians. And here comes Cyrus McCormick to put in place an old school bastion of Princeton orthodoxy out here in the lawless West. And Cyrus and his family, hire a succession of heresy hunters to come serve on the faculty, my predecessors. I've been at McCormick long enough that I knew I didn't know Francis Patton. Hired Francis Patton after he had graduated from Princeton, and he came here, and he became editor of a newspaper. This is an era of newspapers. And he was the soldier of orthodoxy. And he was offended by this man who happened to teach in this congregation, David Swing, the most popular pastor of his time, David Swing. This veteran of the war, this graduate of Miami of Ohio, this master of ambiguity, this pastor of pathos, this great prince of the pulpit, who, from Patton's perspective, was soft on subscription and soft on orthodoxy. And so he swore out accusations of heresy and brought him before the presbytery and said, he's great, he's nice, he's a child of God, but he ought not to be a Presbyterian pastor because he has violated his vows, his oath, his pledges. It's a curious thing, though, right? This old school accusation was argued before a new school court. And the new school presbytery, predominantly new school Presbyterians, would not convict him, Swing. But they appealed to the synod. And Swing said, I'm here to preach, I'm not here to litigate. I'm here to serve, I'm not here to fight. I'm here to confess faith and to encourage the women and men who come to hear me. I'm not here to fight this out in a church court. So he lays aside his Presbyterian ordination and becomes a popular preacher. He's in one of the music halls down on Michigan Avenue, and for the next 20 years has the largest church in Chicago as a non-denominational pastor. Wow, interesting. So we have then an example of one of the sermons that David Swing preached as one of your handouts. It's called A Religion of Words, in which he sounds the themes that will be sounded again and again throughout the remainder of the 19th century and throughout the length of the 20th century, asking us, will we be men and women of the 17th century, or will we seek to find ways by which we might be faithful today? And how is it that the gifts and resources and strengths and insights of the past, of the Westminster Confession, of the Scriptures in their fullness, of the life of the catechisms and of the confessions, how all of that may make us more useful now, not as replicants of some ancient orthodoxy, but rather as servants of the gospel now, today, for these times, with the people we actually know, not the people we merely read about. So that's part of the conflict of that struggle, and I would encourage you to read that sermon to see what you think, because we'll hear it again in the 20s, the same themes, in a sermon that was offered up in the 20s in a New York pulpit in a congregation that had tried to hire John Timothy Stone to be their pastor, but instead he came here, or he stayed here, right, in a little sermon that we're going to look at next week called Shall the Fundamentalists Win? Right.
Before you mentioned the pastor's speech.
Oh, just a second, please.
Does anyone need a copy of the sermon?
Before you mentioned that Pastor Swing went to music halls as the largest church in Chicago, you said something about him serving this congregation. You mean he was actually at Fourth?
At the predecessor, Westminster.
Okay.
Yeah. And there is a portrait of him somewhere in the building. In the manse? All right. Right. So he's still here. And you're right. I mean, the portrait is singed a little bit around the side. But the integrity of his call extends beyond his particular certification, right? And that his service to the ministry then it continues among Presbyterians, although not as a Presbyterian minister, right? And so, do you claim him? Do we learn from him? How do we learn from those who seek to find ways of renewal, revival, reformation, in ways that are attentive to contemporary issues and also attentive to the resources, the strength, the necessity of standing within a tradition which makes some sense out of the confessions, out of the scriptures, of preaching, and of the full gifts of the Reformations in general, but the Reformed tradition in particular. So next week, we're going to leap into the 20th century. And if you do have hip waders, bring them, or hard hats, because there's some fights ahead. There's a big fight in the 20s. And this congregation is right in the middle of it, for good reasons. This congregation finds ways to welcome people who disagree with each other. This congregation finds ways to pray together with people who disagree with one another. This congregation exemplifies, not altogether successfully, but exemplifies the pursuit of ways of faithfulness that recognize difference without demonizing difference. So we'll see some ways in which Fourth sought to do that successfully and some not so successfully. But this also is part of the larger story of denominations into the 20th century. So I hope you're able to join us next week. Thanks for coming along today.